This is the 13th in my series of video articles on how to write short stories. This is the third lesson or video article on Dan Wells's 7-point story structure. And in this lesson, we're actually, I'm going to take a previous story that I had, reconfigure it, and use this structure to give me a story spine for this story if I were ever going to rewrite it. So, just a quick refresher of your memory. The Dan Wells story structure is 7 points, but I've taken 2 out and made it a 5-point structure for short stories because I think 7 points has just a little too much information. The first point is the hook or the setup. Then you've got plot turn 1 or the inciting incident. You've got the midpoint, you've got plot turn 2, and then you've got the resolution. And the unique, or not the unique, but the method that the Dan Wells 7-point story structure, and you can see the earlier videos and you can see where that's derived from. He got it from a book called the Star Trek Narrator's Guide, and I'm pretty sure they lifted it from Sid Field's original work from his 1978, I think, book screenplay. But what Dan does is he starts with the resolution, then goes back to the midpoint, then goes to the hook, and then moves forward. And in the 7-point structure, you have the plot turn, and then you have a pinch point, and there's 2 pinch points after each plot turn. As I said, I've taken those out for conciseness for a short story. The original story idea I had featured a female character called Kate. She had a special forces background so that she wasn't one of these Mary Sue characters who suddenly can kick ass with no training and no reason why. And so she was in the special forces, and her backstory was she was drummed out because a higher ranking officer basically came on to her and she said no, and he did something, and there was an altercation, and she basically slapped him in the face, and so she got drummed out of the special forces because of that. So that's her background. So and there are 2 important pieces in that background. One is the reason why she was drummed out, her reaction to the superior officer's attentions, and then the fact that she has this special force background, so she's got training. So when we see her do things that are kick-ass, we understand why she can do that. And she now works in London as an escort, like a glamour escort, but who actually her real function is she's a bodyguard. And someone emailed me. I've mentioned this story in a previous video article and said it was a bit misogynistic that I said she was a glamour escort. And I emailed back to them and pointed out that sadly, where there are little pockets of society full of rich men with lots of disposable income, you will find attractive women who hire themselves, who are hired out as escorts, and it's not just women as well. Back in the day, I worked in what would be called a cover or function band in London, and we were quite unusual in that there was 4 of us, all male. We were all in our mid-20s, and at a couple of our corporate gigs, we got given cards by women in their like 40s who basically had escort style agencies and were interested in if we would be interested in being hired as escorts for women in their 30s going to posh functions. So it works both ways. Just the male escort kind of thing is a lot more hidden than the female one. So it's not misogynistic. It's sadly a fact of life. So for that person, there's the full answer, and I hope that makes you realise that I'm not being a sexist pig. Here was the first line of the story, and it was, if Kate had worn the Strapper Dior's instead of the Gucci flats, she'd probably have died that night. And then the kicker line, or worse. And it might have been the other way around. It might have been Strappy Gucci's and Dior flats. I can't remember. But I thought I had a killer line, a killer first line. I had a character I was really interested in, and she was in a unique background, and because of the kind of people who would hire her, she'd be in that upper echelon of society where there's lots of money, and where there's money there's always dodgy shit going on, which works perfectly for generating multiple story ideas. With this story, I used the discovery method to write the original, and sadly it just died on its arse. I wrote the story, and there were a couple of great bits of the story. The first part of the story where she's attacked by 4 hired pieces of muscle on the edge of Wimbledon Common as she's being dropped off after a job from a taxi, and she has to evade them, and not only evade them but turn the tables on them. I really enjoyed writing that scene, and it came out really well. But the conclusion of the story just didn't work. As I said, I like the character, thought a number of the stories, but at the last scene, she found the guy who was responsible for setting these guys on her, and she shot him in a public place. I think it was in the lounge of the Ritz, because I gigged there, and so it was a rich environment that I knew quite well. And the story ends with the police sirens getting closer, and we assume that she'll quite rightly go to prison because she's basically murdered somebody, irrespective of the things that he was trying to do to her, which means that morally she is not a baddie, but she's broken the rules of society. You have to go to prison for that. You can't get away with murder. And it was, for me, it was a really flat ending. And it was actually one of the things that turned me off discovery writing, because I was really excited about the initial setup and the character. And it, as I say in the first line on this slide, it just made it die on its arse as far as I was concerned. And so it got filed away. And at that point in time, I was trying to write a short story every week, and I just moved on with other stories. So here's how I created a story spine using the Damwell 7-point structure, although I've trimmed it down to 5 as it's a short story, so that if I ever want to come back to this, I've got something a lot more positive. So the first thing I did was I added information for context, and you'll understand that parenthetical phrase in a second, on Dan Wells' 7-point structure, plus Damon Knight's 5 story types. If you need to go and look at those, there's a video article on each of those story types, plus a video article that summarizes all 5 of those, which you'll find in the playlist for how to write short stories that I've been creating over the last month or so. And I added that information to Claude AI, hence the phrase for context. And then what I did was I created with the AI a workflow to implement this, and I asked Claude to act as my writing partner. Now, the minute I've said AI, some of you may be turned off by that thought and go, there's lots of schools of thoughts on this. So I just want to give you a caveat about what I think at this point in time. It's early July. It's actually Independence Day for those of you in the US. So happy Independence Day. Have a safe day. If you've got fireworks, be careful with them. One day I'll tell you the story of how when I was a musician, we went to a party at our manager's house and I got shot with a firework. It's quite a funny story, but it's a bit of a tangent for this. However, if you've got fireworks, what I wanted to say was be careful, especially if you've got kids around. But I want to give you my thoughts on what I feel about writing in AI at this point in time. So July the 4th, 2025. So first of all, I don't advise you to get AI to do your actual writing. So the actual prose that goes into your story, that should come from you. Because if you get the AI to do it, it both defeats the goal of being a writer, as well as it takes away what's unique and human out of any writing produced this way. So each of us have our own unique set of experiences. We have our own unique set of books that we've read and liked, films that we've seen and watched, and all of these influences do go into, even if really subconsciously, go into the material that we produce. And you can never get AI to replicate that process without brain dumping everything in your brain, except you can't even do that, because some things will just come out when you're writing, and it will only be if you do deep analytical work after and go, wow, that came from this story. I found something in a book a piece of series fiction that I'd written, and I was reading over the winter this year. I've been reading loads of really big, thick historical novels. I watched the Shogun series, and so I've read all the James Clavell novels. And in one of them, a story called Taipan, there's a line where a character says to this boy who's lost, young man, he basically, his father, who was the Taipan, has died, and he calls him Taipan. And the psychological effect that causes, and then the ripples at the end of the story, because the boy goes, or the young adult goes, I am the Taipan, and he starts behaving in that fashion. I found a line of dialogue in one of the serials from this serial fiction, which basically was lifted from that. It did the same psychological thing. Obviously, it wasn't the same dialogue because there was no Taipan in my story. But the point is, had I not read that, I would never have known where that line and the psychological impact it had came from. And so things like that will happen because you'll have read things, they'll be in your subconscious. So if you try and get your AI to actually do your writing, it's going to be very flat and it's going to be devoid of human experience because it doesn't have any. And even though it's got a large model of work to draw from, it doesn't. So each of us have our own information that we resonate with. So when we see something or hear something, for us, we might go, wow, that piece of information or that scene really resonated with me, where for someone else, they might not view it as anything special because they don't have our experiences, which has caused this scene or whatever it is to resonate with us in the first place. So if you're going to write or get AI to do your writing for you, at least pay a ghostwriter to do it, not AI. At least you'll get something that's vaguely human, even if it's not very good. So I don't advocate the actual writing should be done with AI. But where AI is useful is you can train it to work as a brainstorming / outlining partner to help guide your process. And it does this just by asking questions. You provide the details and the framework that you want it to work from, and then tell it to work with you. And I think in a later slide, I've got an important piece of information which I provided, which was something like, you are never to suggest any scenes, characters, or events unless explicitly asked. Do you understand? And so I made it understand. So all it does is the workflow that I created with it basically asks a series of questions which I provide the answers from, and then that gives us a story spine. So I'm going to go through some of those questions. We don't have the space to go through all of them. Question 1 is, what's your core concept for your story in 1 to 2 lines? So that's an easy one. There is a case, not 1 to 2 lines though. I'm renowned for being verbose, as you've probably worked out, but this was my core concept. There is a character, Kate, who has special forces background. She now works as a bodyguard who can be disguised as a glamorous escort. She gets attacked by 4 hired goons, has to escape / defeat them, find out who sent them to attack her, and then deal with that, for the fallout with that, so she's safe in the future. And I wanted a much more positive resolution than the original story, where she basically gets arrested and sent to prison. So question 2, what is the story type? And I chose for this story, I went with a revelation story. There'll be a couple of reveals in the final scene that the story will lead up to. So I went with revelation, and because I've gone with revelation, the pitch of the questions, or the the slant of the questions after this changed because of that. Question 3. The final revelation. As you've chosen revelation story, what hidden revelation will drive/end the story? I initially wrote here, the revelation is that the antagonist, a Hollywood action hero who hired Kate for a film-related promotion, tried to coerce and strong arm her into having sex with him, and I talked about her special forces background and why she was drummed out. She obviously reacted badly to that and basically slapped him around, broke his nose, gave him a black eye, and he's trying to get revenge on that. Question 4, the ending. So describe the final scene where the truth is revealed. So Kate confronts the actor in a public place with a live stream camera he doesn't know about, tells him she has uploaded footage that she got from the earlier incident to YouTube, so that he's basically being exposed as a pretty nasty person. He tries to hit her, and then she hits him again in this confrontation, and people are filming it, and that will probably be kind of the end of the story. Maybe there'll be repercussions. Maybe he gets arrested for attempted assault. But basically, the film he's come to London to help promote bombs because people, what's the word I'm looking for? Not blacklist it, but people, a movement starts on Twitter where people say, don't go to this film, look at this, listen to this footage of this action hero and what he's doing. And before anyone asks, when I originally wrote it, the action hero actor was the adversary in the original story, but he wasn't based on anyone. So please don't anyone say, oh, you've based that on this actor or this actor. It's not. It was the reason I chose a Hollywood action hero actor was it was a good persona to have as an antagonist, someone who'd have lots of disposable money, be used to being surrounded by yes people, plus wouldn't like being humiliated by being beaten up by a woman 2/3 his size or half his size, and would want to do something about it because he's a vindictive prick. So it was all those things, and for me, the character who would fit that the best would be an actor. It wasn't based on anyone, so don't anyone please comment and say you've based this on so and so, because it's not. That was how I chose that profession for the antagonist. And so remember that one of the unique features of this 7-point story structure is that we work from the ending back to the start and then fill in details between the points we've picked up. So the next point, or the next question, is about the midpoint. And the question is, what discovery happens at the midpoint, which points to the reveal? And I put S in brackets because there's more than one reveal in the conclusion. And what Kate does is she calls in a favour from a local Mr. Big, a local underworld guy that she knows. Again, the line of work that she is in. She knows some people who are less than savoury, shall we say. And Mr. Big tells her, and obviously I'm using the phrase Mr. Big as a placeholder, and hopefully if I ever write this scene, Mr. Big will be somebody who is fleshed out and is not just a stereotype of a kind of like a underworld lord kind of character that we've seen in so many films. But he tells her the hired muscle were hired from out of the country, and that the Hollywood actor who we are going to see in the resolution and the conclusion flew into London 2 days previously for promotional work. That leads, we're still going backwards, remember, to the inciting incident, which is also plot term 1. And the question here was, what forces Kate into the main story, and that is something that makes her unable to walk away from the event? And that is that after Kate has outbeefed the hired goons, she finds out that they've not come to beat the shit out of her, but they've come with chloroform and zip ties, which suggests something far, far worse. And she needs to find out who sent them so she can stop. So she's not living in fear of this happening again. That takes us back to the very start of the story, which is the hook. And the question was, what hooks the reader into the story? And there's a bit of crossover in the original question. I've trimmed it down. There were a couple of questions, but for the sake of this video, I've trimmed it down to this. And you could, depending on what kind of length of story, you could spend a little bit of time setting up the character and stuff. But I just wanted to go to the original story start, which is in medias res, starts in the midst of things, and she literally has got out of a taxi. She's just finished an escort job. She never gets a taxi to her house. She always gets off somewhere else and then walks through and makes sure she's not being followed. Again, Special Forces background. She's paranoid as fuck. And then she has to run from those hired goons. And I really like that original story starter, and I wanted to keep that. So that was the hook of the story. Then we go forwards to plot turn 2, which is between the midpoint and the conclusion, and what happens to give the final push, which drives Kate towards the confrontation. And I've written, Kate gets a message to the actor, forces him to meet her. And then when I was writing this, I had a sidebar that when she goes back to her building, which is she lives in and I can picture the building exactly because it was around the corner from where I used to live in Wimbledon. It was like an old converted school, although I've moved it slightly in terms of location and been converted into luxury flats. So she lives in there, and there's a guy in that building who obviously is infatuated with her, and he helps her upload the stuff that she's got to YouTube for the conclusion. But he'll so she, if you remember, she kicks off her shoes. So she's run along some concrete, run into Wimbledon Common, had to walk home with no shoes on, and her feet are bleeding. And when she goes into the building, this guy sees her and asks if she's okay, and she talks to him a bit. So that was the plot turn 2. Now, while I've been recording this, my brain's been whirring away in the background as well. And the other thing that I could do for plot turn 2 is, rather than Kate get a message to the actor, he could contact her, because she'll still have the same number from when she was, or she still has the same phone for being an escort. So we could see her getting a call on one of 3 or 4 different phones, which again tells us something about her as a character. When you've got short stories, you get little details in that have to do double, triple, quadruple duty, because you don't have the space to stretch it out. So if you write something like one of Kate's 3 phones rang, it was the phone from the escort agency or whatever, then that tells us more about the character. Even if we don't say anything more about the different phones and what they're for, that gives us, and the audience, it tells us more about the character, makes her more realistic. And one of the challenges of short stories is making your characters realistic, and you don't have the space to put in voluminous details about their background and what they've done and why they're like this and where they went to school and their hobbies and all that crap. You've just got to get to the point and just put in little slivers of info that the reader can pick up on, which helps build them a clearer picture of the character, or a more 3-dimensional picture of the character. That's the phrase I was looking for. So that gave us a completed story spine. Remember, I compressed this to a 5-point structure. So we get the hook. Kate has to evade, outwit 4 hired goons. We get the plot turn 1. She interrogates the last of the goons and does something bad to one of his knees to make him talk, and she finds out they've come with chloroform and zip ties, and they were to kidnap her, not to beat the shit out of her. Midpoint, she has to call in a favor from Mr. Big. He tells her the muscle was hired from out of town and out of country, and that the Hollywood actor flew into London 2 days before. Plot turn 2, the confrontation with the actor is arranged, and in the previous slide I just mentioned an alternative way that I actually think is a more elegant way of doing it, where the actor contacts her, and then she gets this nerd who we've seen earlier in the story, the tech nerd. Again, note, tech nerd is a placeholder. So when so that I know, it's a placeholder for me, so I know his function in the story. But when we meet him, especially if I do more stories with this character, he'll be a handy ally for her to have. And maybe he's an ally partly because she's obviously pretty and glamorous and he likes her. But maybe she stopped him getting beaten up by 2 or 3 guys at one point in their background, and he feels a sense of thankfulness to her for that. There's all sorts of ways that could be done, but he wouldn't be tech nerd in the story. Again, as I talked about making the characters more 3-dimensional, we try and make him more 3-dimensional, just as with the Mr. Big, the underworld kind of guy, with connections into the organised crime and stuff in London. He would have to be a non-stereotype character. But I use those stereotypical names when I'm outlining because they tell me what their function is in 1 or 2 words. So it's just something I do. When you're outlining and stuff, you don't need to do that. But I thought I'd mention it because I find it a really handy characterization thing initially when you're at this stage where you're just painting the very broad strokes of the story, and then finally the last point, we get the resolution where there's the public confrontation. I still quite like the idea of the Ritz for the confrontation. Kate reveals that she's uploaded footage. The actor gets cross, he tries to hit her. He forgets that she's got Special Forces background, and she evades his pathetic punch and then probably slaps him or breaks his nose again, something like that, and then he gets arrested or something happens so that that threat to her is finished from that point onwards. So, and maybe one other possibility, which again has just something that's just occurred to me, is that Mr. Big also contacts the actor, and maybe that's what triggers the call to her in plot turn 2, to basically say, if anything ever happens to her, you won't be safe anywhere in London. Maybe something like that. But I have to remember it's a short story and got to try and keep it short and focused and as concise as possible, so it can start with a bang and power through to the conclusion. So that's the story spine. I think that will be a much better story than the one I originally wrote. Obviously, I have compressed the process slightly that I went through with working with the workflow that I set up in Claude, but it was really interesting setting this up and using Claude as my story buddy to come up with this story spine. There were some further questions that the workflow had, which I basically paused because I'd got enough information for this video. It's already long enough. So those questions were things like talking about connecting scenes between the main plot points, checking Kate's character arc so that it's not just a plot-driven story, providing stakes and urgency, things like that, which force you then to think about things that then get layered into the story. As I said, I didn't want to go into too much detail because otherwise this would be a 60-minute video, which would be too much. I had enough info for the story spine, so I called it a day there. And I made this couple of notes, one of which I've already touched upon. So the way I got the AI to work was as a combination of secretary, so it's recording all the info I provide, and then when I say summarize it in the correct order, it reorders everything, and it also acts as a prompter. So it says, answer this question, I answer the question, it then asks the next question in the workflow, and doing that is quite an interesting exercise in and of itself, because it has a framework. It has permission to diverge from the framework if it needs to, but as I said, one of the stipulations was you are not to suggest specific plot events or characters unless asked to. So all of the information is coming from my brain. So what's happening is the AI, so rather than me prompting the AI by saying, give me some ideas for a crime story involving blah blah blah, the AI is prompting me. So I've reversed the tables on AI, and I'm using it to prompt me. So all the story info and character info, story ideas come from my brain, and the AI just prompts them and records and reorders it, and then spits the information out to me, and I can then copy and paste it into Scrivener and write the story if I want to. So it was a pretty interesting process. If anyone's interested in that process more, I might turn the workflow into an artifact and put it in the writing vault. But if you are interested, use the email address that I'll share with you on the next screen and let me know, and I'll see if people are interested in that or how I went about it or want to know more details. Anyway, before I get to that final screen, final thoughts on 7-point structure. A caveat: you must remember story models, all the different story models that exist are how one person views story. There's no right way, there's no wrong way. What you need to find is the hardest thing about writing, I think. What you need to find is what's the right story model for you. And you need to find that even if you're a discovery writer as well. As you're probably guessing, I'm veering more on the side of outlining, because that seems to work for me. And whenever I've tried discovery writing, I end up with stories that die on their arse. So I tend to veer towards outlining, but you might be different. And you still need a story model if you're a discovery writer, because you'll write the story and then you need to audit the story and check that it works from a story model perspective, whatever story model you find to be the best. If the 7-point structure is something that works for you, then embrace that and use it. If it doesn't, look for another model. You need to try things out to see what works and what doesn't. And Brandon Sanderson talks about this in his lectures. He said he tried out loads of things until he came upon his own unique combinations. I like to view it in the way that Edison, when he was trying out different materials for the light bulb filament, he famously tried hundreds and hundreds of different materials. And one of his colleagues said, aren't you concerned about all these failures and the time wasting that's going on with these failures? And he said, they're not failures, they're just things that don't work that I've tried, and so I know not to use them again. And I forget how many he tried before he stumbled upon tungsten for the filament, the material to make the light bulb filament. But I think you take that approach with writing experimentation. Try things. If they don't work for you, then you know they don't work for you, and you don't have to use them ever again. And you can look for things that do work for you and start to consciously sculpt your own writing process. So find the story model that works for you. For me, 7-point story structure, it's okay. I think it's a bit basic, but it works. I mean, I got a decent story spine out of it, and interestingly, that story could have expanded from short story length to novella length pretty easily, by putting back the pinch points that I took out, by adding more connecting scenes, because I have more the pinch points will add 2 more major scenes. So if I added a connecting scene between each of those, that will make 13 scenes. So that fleshes it out to maybe 12,000 words. But I didn't want to do that. But so anyway, those are my thoughts on the 7-point structure. Try it out if you don't have a model that you are wedded to, and see if it works for you. And if it does, great. If it doesn't, or bits of it work, keep the bits that work. throw the rest away. In the next episode of How to Write Short Stories, we're going to look at the MVHJ, which stands for the Minimum Viable Hero's Journey. I'll explain more in the next article. And I want to use a version of the hero's journey for short stories. And I'll explain in the next video article why this story model resonates so much for me personally. Doesn't mean, as I said in the previous slide, doesn't mean it will work for you, you will like it, that you have to use it. If you try it and you find it's a crock of shit, just bin it, move on to something else. Until then, if you've got any questions or you're interested in emailing about the process I use to set up the workflow, my email address is paul@deliberate-practice.com. If you're an aspiring or frustrated fiction writer, I've got a resource that you might be interested in called the Writing Vault. Full description will be in the not full description. The link will be in the description underneath the YouTube video, so you can just click on that and go and check it out. Okay, thank you for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.